Imagine growing up in a house where love was felt, but never spoken. A house where actions spoke louder than words, but still something always seemed missing. For most of his life, Mark never questioned his father's love. He knew it was there through the sacrifices, the late nights, the hard work, and the quiet pride his father had for him. But there was one thing that never came. Those three simple words, "I love you." As a child, Mark would wait for it, hoping one day his father would say it, like the other dads he saw in his friends' homes. But those words never came. As he grew older, the gap between father and son widened. Mark became successful, but that longing for his father's approval and love lingered. It wasn't until the passing of his father that Mark truly understood the weight of silence. He uncovered a lifetime of hidden struggles, fears, and emotional baggage his father carried. A man who never knew how to express his love because he never had the words for it. This is the story of a man who spent his life loving his son in his own way, even when he couldn't say it aloud. Join us as we unravel the untold story of the father who never said, "I love you." Mark's father, Tom, grew up in a world where emotions were buried deep beneath the surface. Born in a time when vulnerability was seen as weakness, he never saw affection expressed openly in his own home. His father was a stern man, a man of few words and even fewer hugs. Love, in his world, was something you worked for, not something you talked about. Tom entered the workforce early, doing whatever he could to keep the family afloat. From factory jobs to long shifts at the construction site, he worked tirelessly. Every day was a struggle, but he never let his family know the full extent of it. The idea of showing emotions or vulnerability in front of others was foreign to him. He believed that providing for his family, putting food on the table, and offering a safe home was the truest form of love. As Mark grew older, he began to notice the subtle differences between his father and others. His friends' dads would show up to soccer games with a loud cheer or a fist bump. Their dads would hug them, say, "I love you," and show affection in ways that seemed so natural. But with Tom, there was nothing. There was pride, yes, but it was the quiet kind. Tom's emotional distance wasn't due to a lack of love. It was simply because he didn't know how to express it in the way Mark had always longed for. And for Mark, this absence was a silent burden. As a young child, Mark could never quite grasp why his father never said, "I love you." It wasn't that he didn't feel cared for. On the contrary, he knew his father loved him. But the absence of those three words always seemed like a missing piece to the puzzle of their relationship. Every birthday, Mark would wait with bated breath, hoping that maybe this time his father would say it. The other kids in school would talk about how their fathers told them they were proud of them, how their dads would wrap them in bear hugs after a long day. For Mark, those moments were an alien concept. His father's pride was silent. His affection was buried beneath layers of stoic endurance. As Mark grew into his teenage years, the void between them seemed to grow even wider. The silence became louder, more pronounced, especially as he began to accomplish things in life. He graduated with honors, landed a good job, and even bought his first car, all moments that were milestones for any son, moments that would usually be met with pride and excitement from a father. But Tom's version of pride was different. It didn't come with applause or words of affirmation. It came in the form of a well-maintained car, a new pair of shoes for school, or a quietly spoken good job after Mark had completed something that impressed him. But those words, those three simple words, never came. Mark could never shake the feeling that his father's love was always just out of reach, hidden behind a wall of pride and emotional restraint. That lingering question, why can't he just say it, stuck with him, never fully going away. Though Mark never heard the words "I love you" from his father, he began to realize that love in Tom's world was never about verbal declarations. Instead, it was woven into the small, quiet gestures that marked their lives together. It was in the early mornings when Tom would wake up before anyone else to make sure the lawn was mowed, the snow was shoveled, or the car was ready for the road. It was in the way Tom worked long hours at the factory, never complaining, never asking for a thank you. Tom's love wasn't found in grand gestures or speeches, but in the steady rhythm of his actions, reliable, consistent, and dependable. When Mark was younger, he would sometimes find his father sitting on the porch late at night, staring out into the distance. There, Mark would join him, silently sitting at his side. Though there were no words exchanged, those moments felt meaningful, like a connection that was understood without being spoken. Sometimes Tom would offer Mark a cup of hot cocoa after a long day, or a quiet nod of approval when Mark accomplished something significant. These were his ways of saying, "I care," even if they didn't have the words to go with them. And yet, Mark couldn't help but wish that one day his father would look him in the eye and say the words that seemed to elude him. It wasn't that the gestures weren't enough. It was just that words, those simple words, held a power he couldn't explain. They held the promise of something deeper, more vulnerable, more personal. As Mark grew older, he began to see these small gestures for what they were, a father's unspoken love. Tom wasn't incapable of love. He just expressed it in his own way, a way that wasn't always easy for Mark to understand. But over time, those silent actions began to make more sense. They weren't just habits or routines. They were love in its purest form, unspoken but undeniable. As Mark entered adulthood, the distance between him and his father began to take on a new shape. Though he had achieved success in his own life, the questions that had lingered since childhood about his father's love were still unresolved. He found himself yearning for the approval he never fully received, constantly seeking validation in places that couldn't fill that void. It wasn't until Mark became a father himself that the weight of his father's silence started to make sense. Holding his own child in his arms, he began to realize something profound. Perhaps it wasn't his father's inability to express love, but rather his own expectations that had been misplaced. Mark began to see his father through new eyes, understanding that love wasn't always about the words you say. Sometimes it's about the things you do. Mark thought back to those early years, the way his father would quietly provide, protect, and guide him without needing to speak the words. The sacrifices Tom made, the quiet pride he showed in Mark's successes, and the way he was always there, those were the real signs of love, even if they didn't come wrapped in a bow of verbal affirmation. As Mark reflected, he realized that his father's silence wasn't a sign of distance, but of a different kind of love, one that didn't require constant verbal reinforcement. It was a love built on actions, on showing up day after day, on giving what was needed even when it wasn't asked for. The realization didn't come overnight, but it did come with peace. Mark finally understood that his father had loved him more than words could express. And while he might have wished for more verbal affirmation, the love he needed had always been there, quietly embedded in everything his father did. When Tom passed away, Mark was left with a complicated mix of emotions. He had lived a life full of questions and longings that had never quite been answered. But as the days passed after his father's death, something began to shift in Mark's heart. A deep understanding that had been waiting to emerge all along. One day, as Mark was going through his father's belongings, he found a letter that his father had written to him many years ago. The letter was tucked away in an old drawer, yellowed with age, and it was filled with words that Mark had never imagined would be there. In the letter, Tom spoke of his pride, his hopes for Mark's future, and his love for him. It wasn't an "I love you" in the way Mark had expected, but it was something more meaningful, an honest and raw expression of affection, one that was too difficult for Tom to say aloud. It wasn't until that moment that Mark truly understood. His father had loved him with every fiber of his being, but the words simply never came because they were never part of the language Tom knew. The final conversation Mark had with his father was silent, yet it spoke louder than anything they had shared before. It was a moment of closure, a silent acknowledgement of the love that had always been there, unspoken but real. In that moment, Mark realized that sometimes love doesn't have to be said aloud. Sometimes it just needs to be felt, understood, and accepted. Sometimes the love we crave isn't found in the words we expect, but in the quiet moments, the sacrifices, and the unspoken gestures that make up a life. Mark's story is not just about a father who never said, "I love you." It's about understanding that love comes in many forms, and sometimes the most profound expressions are those that don't require words at all. In life, we often search for validation and affection in ways that feel familiar to us, based on what we see others experience. But the truth is, love is personal, and it's not always expressed in the same way from one person to the next. Tom may not have spoken those 3 words, but he showed his love through years of hard work, quiet pride, and the small yet powerful gestures that left an indelible mark on his son's heart. So, take a moment to reflect on your own relationships. Are there unspoken words that hold more meaning than you realize? Perhaps, like Mark, you've been looking for love in places it's always been, just in a different form. Remember, love doesn't have to be said aloud. Sometimes it's enough to just feel it in the silence. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. And remember to appreciate the love you have, even if it's never spoken.